Hello and welcome. Today, I'm happy to have a new guest for discussing a little bit about relocation. And today we're traveling to Canada. And I'm happy to have her here also because her name is Liliana and I'm Viviana. So this is already something we have kind of in common. She's Italian of origin, now living in Canada. So welcome with us, Liliana. The first question I'm going to ask you is a little bit about you and your story and how you ended up in Canada, if you want to tell us a little bit.
Yeah, so my name is Liliana Vercellotti. I grew up in northern Italy, not very far from you, Viviana.
Yeah, exactly.
In Piemonte, different region on the west part. And I lived in Italy pretty much all my young life until I was about 20. And then I started studying foreign languages in Italy. It's kind of funny that I'm speaking English with an Italian person. So I was like, my brain has to adjust. It's like, oh my goodness, what's happening? So yeah, and after like when I was like 21 and 22, I wanted to study English abroad. I didn't want to just complete my degree in Italy. And so I went to the United States. I visited a cousin that I had in Massachusetts. And then I went back as an au pair. And then I went back and I completed my bachelor and my master degree. And so that ended up being a 10-year period in the US. I also worked in between my bachelor and my master. Yeah, and then after that, I went back to Europe for a while. I lived in Geneva. I came to Italy because my dad was not feeling well at that time, and there were some family problems. And then I moved back to Canada. So I kind of went back and forth for quite a few years. So I've been in Canada for 10 years. I've been in the US for 10 years, and in Switzerland and Italy in between for about 2 years. So yeah, and I haven't found my home.
Yeah, a question that actually was not on the list, but now that you mentioned Piemonte, because you know there are some Italian communities that are stronger abroad, and Piemontesi nel mondo are one of those. Did you have any connection with them in like the US or Canada or Switzerland?
This is the first time I hear that, and I wish I knew it before. No, I actually didn't. And this is probably one of the strangest things. Like when I went to the US the first time, I was always connected to either a school or a program. So I never, I mean, I know I did have some friends in the US, in Salt Lake, where I lived, because they were the same religion that I grew up Catholic, but then I became Mormon. So I had a friend that she is Mormon, and she lives in Salt Lake up to this day. And so when I first moved there as a student, I was in contact with her, and she grew up in the same city where I grew up. Like we went to the university, we met at the university. And so then she got married and she moved to the US. So yeah, I mean, that was my connection. That's it, one person. Is in terms of association, I didn't really have any connection.
So Canada and Vancouver especially, Canada is a big country. Can you tell us a little bit of the country, like maybe any difference between different regions, and then Vancouver, the city, what's about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Where to start? So I moved to Vancouver in 2010. I first visited during the Olympic Games. There was the Winter Olympics. It was actually the city after Torino. So I was like, oh, I'm just going there. So I went there with a friend, and everybody was excited about Vancouver at that time. There was so much marketing done about being one of the most livable, most beautiful cities in the world. And so that was very attractive. But as we know, there's a difference between being a tourist and living there. So long story short, I ended up going as a tourist, and then I went back and I wanted to study. I did a certification to become an executive coach, even if I already had my master's degree. And sorry, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but basically I went on a whim. Like there wasn't really a plan to move to Vancouver. I wanted to go back to the United States, but at that time I left my job before I went back to Italy. And it was 2010, so it was a couple of years after 2008 and the crisis in the US. And so I didn't know how to go back and immigrate to the US because I wasn't a citizen. And I could have gone as a PhD student or doing something, but it was like, no, I'm just going to try Canada. And Vancouver is beautiful, multicultural, very expensive, but it wasn't easy for me to just immigrate. Like it was the same, not exactly the same, but it was similar process in the US. So it really wasn't like, oh yes, I'm moving to Vancouver and I have all my ducks in a row, and so on. So I don't know if I answered your question.
It's interesting also because like before moving to Malta, actually that year I was in Canada. I spent a few months in Canada in Montreal.
Okay, so
so and I was studying migration. I was working on a project on migration, and I realized that also sometimes in Europe we have some information from the US, and in those here from Canada was a place where it's easy, everyone is welcome, but actually their studying migration was not so things were complicated, and also there were like documents you need to provide, and so there was a process in migration, and then it's even the differences between Quebec and all the other
yes, Quebec has a different immigration. They say it's easier in Quebec if you speak French. Sorry to interrupt, but
no, exactly. And so you moved quite a lot. So
I did, yes, I am.
And what were your cultural shock moving maybe from Italy to the US? And even because you mentioned Salt Lake City, and also like I was in Salt Lake City in, I think it was 2016, and actually we traveled. So we arrived in San Francisco, and then we drove in Salt Lake City and then Arizona. And we already knew a little bit because we like the US, so we like traveling to the US. So it's not the same California, it's different from Utah, it's different from New York. And they say there are 11 cultures in the US. So how was for you, and what were maybe the cultural shock in Utah, in Salt Lake City, if you had any?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I felt very fortunate when I moved to Utah at the time that I moved there, which was, oh my goodness, it's like I'm old. It was 1998. 98 to 2007. I left at the end of 2007. I also lived in Oregon, sorry, I should say. Utah was a safe haven because Utah is one of those places where, at least at that time, is very family oriented, because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, it's the nickname, it's a very family oriented church. So you had a lot of, culturally speaking, you had quite a bit of people that spoke Spanish, like Mexican. I wouldn't say a lot of African Americans, as far as I know, but more like a Hispanic, Latino community beside the rest. And for me personally, I didn't feel a lot of cultural shock. I felt more cultural shock in Canada, and I will explain why. Because I was going to school, I was in a system, I was going to the church school. Brigham Young University is sponsored by the Church of Jesus Christ, the Latter-day Saints. So, and it's subsidized, so it's also not a very expensive school, like Ivy League school, like we think of Yale, we think of Harvard, and people say, oh, how did you afford to study in the US? Well, I did because it was the church school, and it was a beautiful private campus. So back to the cultural shock, there wasn't a lot of cultural shock there. The only cultural shock was maybe that, I missed, and that was before Utah. It was when I did my 1 year nanny au pair in America exchange. That was 96 and 97 in Oregon. That was difficult. Again, I love the American people. I feel like they're very similar to Italian, like they're very engaging, very talkative, positive. I love that part. And the only shock was like missing my, my friends in Italy, or worrying about my dad. Like I come from a small family, so I felt like I left my dad, I call him all the time. He calls me on Sunday and we talk, but so I was missing my, my people.
Yes.
But it wasn't like, the food or I never grew up in a place in Italy where I was so attached to tradition. And for me, that was a plus in a way. And so there was a lot of cultural shock. I would tell you there is cultural shock. There was cultural shock when I went to Canada.
And that I'm so curious also because there are like a lot of jokes between like the US and Canada. So I'm really curious.
And it's very true what you're saying. And when we talk about the US, you know, a person that has maybe lived in New York City and went to Columbia University, completely different experience, I think, than a person that went to Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, because they're different lifestyle, different communities. You are in a metropolis versus a small town. It's safe. I've always felt safe. You know, like when we look at what's happening in the US now, sometimes I feel like that's really hard to grasp for me, because I never seen violence. I've never seen, you know, even as a person, I mean, I was going home from the library with my bike at 11:30 p.m. It's very safe. But somebody else that lived in other places in the US might not have that type of experience, whether it's 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or now. Canada, so I lived in small town USA for many years. It was like 7 years. Yeah. And then in Oregon, I was on the outskirts of Portland, which is a beautiful city. I love Oregon. It's very green, Pacific Northwest, rains all the time.
I was also thinking, because maybe you can also, you had a lot of international experiences. Do you think there is maybe some skills that now, if you're like going back to when everything started in Italy, now you can think that through the migration experience, you actually have skills and they have been developed through the migration process?
Yeah, a lot of self-reliance, I would say, both from an emotional perspective and a logistical perspective. I mean, I've been in places by myself where I had to find where the pharmacy was, or the, you know, like the station, or, you know, just the logistics, but also emotionally, I would say. During COVID, I noticed this. I relied a lot on connection that I have in other parts of the world. But you always want to create, one of the skills is to create connection, even if you don't have physical connection.
Yeah.
And then how do you create physical connection? Like a lot of times, or I looked at organizations that were there for expats. I think there's so much opportunity nowadays, and I'm talking pre-COVID, in terms of meeting, you know, other people that also moved to a new place recently, and so you kind of help each other, you support each other. I think the connection for me is something that I learned the hard way, and I'm still learning. It might be a different issue if you immigrate with your spouse, or with your children, or if you come with your parents. You know, if you're younger and you come with your parents as well. So I don't know if I answer your question.
Absolutely, and I think it's funny because you mentioned pharmacy, and my friends always make fun of me because it happened that in all the city where I lived, I was actually close to the pharmacy, and for me, it was good because, so, you know, I had this surgery for endometriosis, so now it's something I need to treat it. But before, I was also suffering from migraine, so having a pharmacy close to me was actually good. And but then during COVID, I think what you mentioned also was really important. So migrants, expats, they realize how important also to be knowledgeable about the health system in the country, and so where the pharmacy, where the doctors, how to get to the healthcare, and also the support, the connections, and so actually what you do nowadays, you also have Facebook groups that help people, especially women, to connect.
Yeah. So what do I do? I've done a lot of things as an immigrant, as an expat. When I first moved to Canada, I thought, I'm just going to work for an NGO, because my master's in nonprofit management, and I always wanted to work for charities. Vancouver is not the hub, is not the center of that. Ottawa would be, or Toronto, but I love Vancouver. So even if there were very few nonprofit organizations, I stick with my plan. I ended up working for an organization that was like a family-run, it was more like a family-run foundation. So they didn't have employee, and therefore they couldn't sponsor me. But they did give me the opportunity to get a working visa, which was like a charitable working visa for 6 months, and then for another 6 months. And after that, I actually went to Tanzania. So I went back and forth in 2014 and 2015. I stayed in Canada for some of the time, and then sometimes I stayed in Tanzania for like 4 or 5 months, and I started with them to supervise. I went to visit a health center that they had in Tanzania, in Mwanza, and then I was finishing my contract with them. And then I started with another small nonprofit organization that was working with like women in the slums and so forth. So that was my experience working in Canada. I didn't get sponsored. So then after that, I did all sorts of things. Like I did vacation rental. I had 2 apartments, and one of them, I started renting it out for short-term rental when I wasn't there, when I was living in Tanzania. And then the other one, I rented it as well. And that was my sort of like side way of, creating income. Yeah. And it worked okay, because, when you live in a rural area in Tanzania, the cost of living is nothing like Vancouver. So I kind of got by. And now what I do now is, after last year, I decided to go back to coaching because I have a certification as an executive coach. I started to coach managers in nonprofit organizations in Vancouver. And then I stopped and I went to Tanzania and did other things. Now I want to go back and focus on women that are single, that are without kids like me, because it's really difficult. And especially I would say, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a global citizen, but not everybody is like me. But I think that a lot of time what I struggled with in my life, even before when I had a partner, it was to create a sense of community. And so I think you can create a sense of community, ideally, where you live. But you also can create a sense of community, especially now that we have, COVID, online. Yeah. Like a lot of time, I hear people saying, "Oh, I don't know a lot of people. I just moved here, right before COVID or 6 months before." Well, how do you create community? You create community, a stronger community, with the people that are your family or your friends or organization online, even if maybe they're not in your town. And then eventually you build community in your town. Yeah. So that's what I think it's important. So right now I am a redefinition coach for women that are without kids. And I'm also doing consultation for relocation. Like if somebody wants to move abroad, especially if you want to study abroad, if you want to do a working holiday visa, which is something that in Canada, it's still possible. But I think you need a job offer to do that right now. So, yeah.
Good. And so we're almost at the end, and this is also because one of the programs that I'm offering, relocation. So I will ask you what I'm asking to all our guests on relocation. Can you give us like 3 tips to people that maybe want to, or they're planning, or they're curious about relocating to Canada and maybe Vancouver especially?
I would say do your homework. So basically do the opposite of what I've done 10 years ago, which I was madly in love with Vancouver because it was on the radar due to the Olympics. Do your homework, look at the cost of living, look at your resume, and what kind of job do you want to do? Do you have connection in terms of where to apply, what job to apply to? Look at the industry, and really, like, I had a good, even if I'm still not a Canadian citizen, but I had a good immigration lawyer that always assisted me with the student visa, with the work visa, with every other time that I was going back and forth between like Europe, Tanzania, and here. So get good connection in terms of immigration work, and just establish yourself. And if you have friends or family or relatives that live where you want to go, whether it's Vancouver or somewhere else, it's going to be so much easier. Yeah. It's going to be so much easier. So always look for support and look at what you can offer. I mean, a lot of time as a skilled worker, you can immigrate to Canada, like if you are in one of the professional categories that they are in demand, and look at websites. And if you need a relocation consultant, I can do some of that. And then when it becomes specific to like to finding housing or finding certain resources, I can refer you. But yeah, that's the best. The other thing is culturally, Canada is very diverse. So don't think of Canada like a one place fits all, because there's so many different opportunities. Like in Quebec, if you speak French, excuse me, you can easily look into Quebec as a different immigration system. If you like the winter, you're going to be fine. But if you don't, I would say be very careful, because most of Canada has harsh winter, and you'll have to deal with that. The other tip is, yeah, you really have to know yourself and what you can take as the benefits and what are the sacrifices. Because if you're not willing to sacrifice, for example, if you don't like the cold and you're like, oh yeah, I like the quality of life, I like that I can get a good job. It's a big diverse multicultural country, but I really hate winters. That might affect you. Yeah. It did affect me.
No. I can totally relate, yeah. Because when I was in Montreal, it was April. It was so cold and snowing, and in Italy, it was like Easter. So the day after Easter, Pasquetta, everyone was like doing barbecue. Pasquetta. Exactly. And I was there. It was so cold. And I was watching all these pictures on Facebook of people having their barbecue. Yes.
Yeah, I can relate to that. It was snowing here last week. What was it? Like April 22nd, I think it was snowing. Only for one day, but I thought, okay, you don't really put your winter coats away. It's just going to be there just in case. Yeah.
So thank you so much. I think it was grateful.
You're welcome.
And yeah, do the homework and find the support. It's so true, because the more you are prepared, the more you can mitigate your cultural shock, and the more also you know yourself, where you can fit better than in other places. So thank you. If you want to move to Canada, get in touch with Liliana, and I hope this is just the beginning, and we will collaborate again in the future. Thank you again, and take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.